You're listening to a Thames Estuary Partnership podcast, celebrating London's famous tidal river. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Talk of the Thames. I'm your host, Chloe Russell. Thank you for joining me today. I'm looking forward to sharing today's episode with you. We have the wonderful and well-known mudlarker Lara Maiklem as our guest for today's episode. Lara is a British author, editor, and publishing consultant known for her writing and speaking on mudlarking. One of her books, Mudlarking, Lost and Found in the River Thames, was awarded Sunday Times Bestseller, an Observer Book of the Year, Radio 4 Book of the Week, and winner of the 2020 Indie Book Award for Non-Fiction. I mean, wow. What a treat to spend an afternoon chatting with her. Now, without further ado, let's get stuck in. A big warm welcome to London Thames mudlarker Lara Maiklem. Lara, how are you this fine day?
Hello, Chloe. Well, thank you for inviting me along. I'm not great, actually. Well, no, I feel absolutely fine. I've got COVID.
Yeah, that's not great.
It's not great, but I feel fine. I'm just really frustrated that I'm stuck inside for this quarantine period. But apart from that, I just feel like I've got a little bit of a cold and I'm fine. So I can't complain.
That's good. It's weird how it affects people differently.
It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I know people have been really sick with it, but I've been lucky. So, yeah, can't complain.
It's a shame that you have to be locked up for so long.
I know.
That must be like the worst thing for you, isn't it?
Well, it is, but it's not, because it's forcing me to write at the moment.
That's not
it's
too bad.
Making me stay in and sit. I've got no excuses at all. So I've got so much to do that and I feel fine, so I can sit at my desk and work. So my agent's very happy, I think.
That's good. That's brilliant. So it's not all too bad.
No, not all bad. So yeah,
that's good. Well, let's start from the top. For those that are listening and aren't familiar with the term mudlarking, can you tell us what a mudlarker is?
I certainly can. Well, a mudlark, simply put, is somebody who goes and searches rivers for objects that have been lost or thrown away or dropped over the years. It's quite an old phrase. It began, the first written mention of the word mudlarks was the end of the 18th century, and that was by a man called Patrick Calhoun, who was describing these bands of nefarious characters who were preying on the West Indian ships that were lying at anchor just off Wapping and Rotherhithe for sometimes up to 6 months at a time, with their very, very valuable cargoes of spices and rum and sugar. And they were being preyed on by these gangs, and they had amazing names like Scuffle Hunters and River Pirates and Game Lightermen. And they'd go on board and they'd steal what they could and they'd throw it off the ships into the mud. And it was the mudlarks that came along and found these little packets of sugar and bladders of rum and took them off to the taverns in Rotherhithe and Wapping to sell into the black market. Now, fast forward through to the mid-1800s, and the social commentators, Victorian social commentators, were writing really very evocatively and very beautifully about these creatures who worked the banks of the Thames when the Thames, because of course the Thames is tidal, when it goes down twice a day, you can get onto the riverbed. And they were searching the riverbeds, looking for anything they could sell, anything they could use, so rope or wood, or if they were lucky, maybe a copper nail. And it was mainly women and old people and children, people on the very fringes of society who couldn't do anything else. It was how they made a living. It's how they kept themselves out of the workhouse, which of course everybody absolutely lived in horror of. And so if you think at the time the river was really little more than a running cesspit, they were wading around in this without any shoes on. And it really was a desperate living. And then fast forward again to now, I'm a very modern mudlark. I don't do it to stay out of the workhouse or make a living. I do it because I'm interested in it. I'm a sort of amateur historian, and I go down to this is a very long-winded explanation, but I go down onto the river, the bed of the River Thames on the low tides, and I look for objects that have been lost and thrown away that can spread back 2,000 years or more, because it's all down there. The story of London is down there, lying there, and it changes on every tide.
That's amazing. So what inspired you to get into this line of curiosity?
I've always been fascinated by the past. I think I grew up in a very old house, And it was that sense that other people have been there, that sense when you can actually lay your hands on history, something old, like an old house, or pick up something old. And it's that sense of making a contact with the past, with people who've been there before, who maybe really haven't left anything of themselves, but maybe, you know, a fingerprint in some wall plaster or initials scratched on a precious object. And so I've always been fascinated by that. And we had a Victorian midden in the garden bed. We had, it was a farm I grew up on. We had an abandoned medieval village at the top of the farm, so that whenever the plough went through that, we could go and pick up bits of pottery and things like that. And I was always on the lookout for unusual things. I think I've always been looking down. And so when I moved to London in the early 90s after university, I was searching for somewhere to escape from the city. And, you know, I'd grown up in the countryside. I like spending time on my own. The river was the obvious place to go. It was empty. It was natural. It was desolate. There was nobody there. And for a few years, I just walked the river paths, you know, beside it. And then one day I found myself at the top of this set of rickety wooden stairs looking down and wondering why I hadn't gone down onto the foreshore before. And I went down and I found a clay pipe stem. And I knew what it was because I'd found them in the garden at home and reasoned that there was probably more there. And every time I went back, I found something new. And it gets obsessive. It's like a big lucky dip. You know, you don't know what you're going to find next. It really does get obsessive. And that's how it all began.
Amazing. That's so good. How long have you been doing it for now then?
I've been doing it for about 20 years.
Wow. Isn't that amazing? That's
yeah,
so
on and
cool.
off for about 20 years.
Love that.
And it was when I lived in London, it was my escape from the city. Ironically, I don't live in London now. I live close to London, but it's probably about the only thing that sort of lures me back to the city. I don't go shopping. I hate shops and I hate things like that. I go back to London for museums and the river. That's about it.
I love that. I really love that. I was going to ask, like, can anybody go mudlarking, or is it like, for a family day trip, can people just go down there? Like, what are the rules that people need to think about?
Well, there are rules and regulations. It's a fragile place. You know, it needs to be treated with respect. So there are rules and regulations. There are areas that are protected, scheduled monuments where nobody's allowed to mudlark at all. Anybody mudlarking on the foreshore anywhere in the tidal Thames between Teddington and the Thames Barrier, they don't encourage you to go further than the Thames Barrier, needs a permit from the Port of London Authority. And as you probably know, they administer the tidal Thames, the foreshore of the tidal Thames, and look after it. And they give out these permits. They're really easy to get. You just go to the website, Port of London Authority website, and you can apply for them. Anyone can get them. They last for 3 years. And I think they're about £90 now, which some people sort of suck their teeth at. But actually, you know, think how much it costs to go on the London Eye. It's actually fairly good value for 3 years. And under the terms of your permit, you should check the maps that go with it. There are areas where you're not allowed to disturb the foreshore at all. You're not allowed to dig, you're not allowed to scrape or move anything. As I say, there are scheduled monuments where you're not allowed to go at all. If you find anything over 300 years old and of archaeological importance, it's really important that people report it. It needs to be reported to a finds liaison officer. There's one for London at the Museum of London, and he works for a project called the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which has been around for quite a few years now. And they record all the objects that are found out of context in fields by metal detectorists, on beaches, on rivers where mudlarks find them. And they're the objects that aren't found in archaeological digs. They're not stratified. They're not found in layers. So they don't necessarily relate to anything, but they're important in their own right. And they've recorded over 1 million of these objects.
Wow.
And it's a really, really valuable database. It's there for anyone to look at online, and it's really interesting. And we need to keep adding to it because it's all our story. It's our shared history, and it shouldn't just be put in a drawer and forgotten about. Heaven forbid it shouldn't be sold online and traded, because it's important. It tells a story. I should say the objects you find you actually can't sell. You don't own them. The Port of London Authority owns everything you sell. They're very, very generous. They let you keep most of it, almost all of it, but you don't own it, so you can't sell it. You can't start up an Etsy shop and do all of that. Hold on a minute. If you find anything over 300 years old, made of more than 10% precious metal and not a single coin, then by law you have to report it. Coroner's treasure. So it's really important you follow all these rules and regulations, because otherwise, you know, it's not respectful mudlarking. You know, it's just a smash and grab, and that's wrong for so many reasons. You know, digging and scraping and doing all of that, you're disturbing the ecology of the foreshore. The most important bit's that top few inches. And if you're constantly scraping it away, you're scraping away all the homes of all these little creatures and the spawning grounds and important places like that. So it's important to do it properly. It's important to report what you find.
Wow. What would happen what would you get fined if you didn't, if you did put it, say, on Etsy and then people found that, or what would be the consequences?
You can do. Yes, they do keep an eye on it. The Portable Antiquity Scheme keep an eye on what's being sold online. The Portable London Authority takes an interest in what's going on. And it's quite likely that if you are taking the mickey, that they will step in and do something about it, because it's the rules, it's the law. You are on private land when you're down there. So, you need to abide by the rules.
Okay. Gosh. All right. You hear that, everybody? I would consider you a professional mudlarker, right?
Okay, I don't know about that.
Is there some sort of hierarchy in that? I guess you get beginners, don't you?
I suppose you get people who haven't done it for long. You do get people who have just started, and people who've been doing it for a long time. I don't know if there is such a thing as a professional mudlark these days, because I would say that a professional is someone who earns their living from what they find, and you sort of, since you're not allowed to do that, then everybody's a hobbyist, an amateur. So I would say, yeah. I mean, I'm not an archaeologist, so that's not my profession. So it really is my hobby. It really is something I do for interest and for fun.
I love that. What sort of equipment do you need to go down to the foreshore?
Well, like I say, I don't dig and I don't scrape, so I don't have any sort of digging equipment with me. I don't use a metal detector. Some people do. All I have is a pair of knee pads, really, and a very unfashionable bum bag. Nice. That are becoming harder and harder to get your hands on. And gloves. I always wear latex gloves because obviously raw sewage still goes into the river. You know when there's been a sewage spill because it smells dreadful. Yeah, and you see all the things that are washed up on the foreshore.
Oh no.
Yeah. And so I always wear gloves I've had a couple of bouts of what I call Thames tummy, and it's not very nice. So I try and avoid that if I can.
Fair.
So really my equipment and a pair of waterproofs and a good pair of boots. So you really don't need much. As long as you wear a good pair of shoes and you're dressed for the weather, then that's really, really all you need is your eyes to go down there.
I read in your book, Mudlarking Lost and Found on the River Thames, you mentioned that there's a divide of hunters and gatherers, and you can divide that by the gender. So the hunters are predominantly male and gatherers are predominantly female. And I was interested if you could expand that for our listeners, what do you mean by that? And why do you think that could be the case?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously you should never generalize.
No, I know, but I mean, you're on the field and you're picking up data with your mind.
Absolutely. And from what I have seen over the years, it's very rare. I don't think I've ever seen a woman with a metal detector on the foreshore. It's very rare to see a woman with a metal detector on the foreshore. I've never seen one. So, there is a mindset, I think, with people who detect. They're looking for metal objects. They're looking for coins. They're looking for different objects. Certainly, I think things are changing, definitely changing. Certainly years ago, I mean, you didn't see many women on the foreshore years and years ago. There's a lot more women doing now, which is wonderful. And women tend to have a different approach to mudlarking. It's a bit more meditative. It's a bit, obviously you can't generalize because there are men who approach it in a similar way, but they tend to approach it in a more meditative, a little bit more of a relaxed way, maybe. It's less competitive. Men can be very competitive. I think if you speak to anyone who does metal detecting as a hobby, they'll tell you about the competition that can happen. I think that sort of digging and scraping and using a metal detector is quite focused. Is very focused. You're very focused on the on finding something, whereas an amble along the foreshore looking for something interesting is a very different search. I think
it's the process.
Psychologically, it's more of a process. It's more of a rounded process. You're there for other reasons as well.
It reminds me of Blue Mind. Have you heard of that?
No.
So Blue Mind it's a term made by Wallace J. Nichols, and the idea is that there's ample research proving that blue spaces, such as the Thames, they provide you, they create a happy space in your mind, and they get you more connected and better at what you do. So the idea is that when you're near water, it makes you really happy.
Mm.
So the idea is that when you're going around the foreshore and you feel like quite tranquil, it's actually because just being in that blue space on so many different like scientific levels, it is actually a really positive thing for you to be doing. And it is interesting because you were going into that state of mind when you're walking there.
Absolutely. I mean, we've lost touch with the outside world in many ways, haven't we? We've sort of shut ourselves away in houses and offices and cities, and everybody needs, I think, to get outside, to get in touch with. It's a basic human need. It's quite primitive to get outside and get in touch with your environment and what's around you. And mudlarking does that. You can do it in the middle of the city. You can escape from all of the city, and you can be, as you say, in a blue mind. You can be in this wonderful space that's really quite raw and quite wild and open. And you could be anywhere with the sound of the waves and the smells and the open air. You know, there's no buildings overcrowding you, and even the weather. You know, you really feel the weather on the river where you don't in the city because all the buildings are blocking it. So you really feel like you're back in the outside world and in nature. And it really, I do find it's a very resetting process for me. You know, I sort of reset myself on the foreshore, and then I can go back into the city and do it all again, because it does eat you up and spit you out, London. But it has got this wonderful space right in the centre of it. And so, if I come back with nothing, I've had a wonderful time. You know, for me, it's not about the treasures, you know, the things, the objects. Obviously it is, you know, they're fascinating and it's amazing to find them. But even if I come back with nothing, or very little, it's still, you've had that much time to reset.
You really connected to it.
Yeah.
How long would you say that you're on the Thames for, like on average, on one of your days out?
We see that's something that's changed as well. When I lived in London, I lived beside the river, so I could pop down for 20 minutes if I wanted to. Since I've moved away, it's a very sort of, I come back specifically to go mudlarking. So rather than lots of small visits, I now make longer visits. So I'm probably spending more time on the river, but I spend it differently. And so you have about 2 to 3 hours either side of low tide where you can safely be on the foreshore. So I'm down there sort of between 5 and 6 hours at a time.
Nice. That's really good. Why is it that you can visit the same place over and over again, but the Thames can still spit out new things?
Well, I mean, the foreshore, particularly in central London, really in central London, is almost entirely artificial. The first, the top good few feet, I don't know how deep it is. It's been built up. It's a work environment. It's been built up. I mean, rivers are naturally a V shape. But if you look at the foreshore in London, it's sort of flat. It's because it's been built up, turned into these barge beds, which were flat surfaces next to the river wall for the flat-bottom barges to rest on. And they did that in the 18th and 19th centuries. And what they did was they just dumped a load of domestic waste and industrial waste and building spoil and rubble and whatever they could get their hands on, packed it all down hard, put a chalk cap on top because that was nice and soft. It didn't damage the bottom of the barges. That's what the foreshore is made out of. When you stand on the foreshore, if you look down, it's all artificial. It's all pretty much made of stuff that people have put there. It's a working environment, and the barges and the ships stopped coming in the 1960s, or coming up to central London, and they stopped repairing it. So they stopped repairing the revetments, which are wooden structures that hold in all this rubbish. They stopped filling in the holes, and the river is turning itself back into a natural V shape, and it's eating away at all this rubbish, and it's eroding it. And the clipper service is causing a huge amount of erosion because of these double-hulled clippers that go very fast. And if you're down there, you see these waves come in and it sucks it back. And every time it does that, it's eroding more and more rubbish and scattering it. And so that's why you find so much stuff.
Is that why, because of this sort of material, is that why things are preserved so well?
It is, yes. I mean, and Thames mud's anaerobic, so there's no oxygen gets into it.
Wow.
It preserves things perfectly. It preserves the shine on brass.
Wow.
It preserves leather and wood, and even fabric it's preserved. So you can I've pulled a Tudor shoe out.
A whole shoe?
A whole shoe, child's shoe. Perfect, absolutely perfect. Only the stitching had gone. Completely one piece. And I could even see just the little imprint of the toes and the heel at the back of it was like it had been lost yesterday. It was incredible. So yeah, it's a time capsule.
How did it make you feel when you found it?
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. It was like reaching back through time and actually shaking hands with that person. You know, there's nothing more personal than a shoe. It's got the little sort of creases across the front. And you know, like I say, it could have been dropped yesterday. I'll never know who owned it. I'll never know the name of the person who owned it or what they look like. But you've got that little, just that connection with that one person from the past. It's just incredible.
That is really incredible. I love that. I love, like, in your book, you really go into depth about, like, the stories that could have been behind these objects. And it's just so great to get inside your head and be really immersed in, like, your experiences. And I think you do. You describe it really well as well. I think it's really done really well. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it is, you know, you are mudlarking with ghosts. You really are. You know, you get that real sense that there are these sort of people down there with you, you know, and the great thing is that these aren't objects that belong to famous people. They're not the people who got streets named after them or statues made of them or books written about them. People like you and me who, you know, have just been forgotten. You know, they've just lost to time, but they have left these little clues behind. As long as you know what these objects are, you can make up what you like, you know, about who owned them. How you described it just then as ghosts, I think that's a really good way of describing them, because like London has so much history as well, and there's bound to be ghosts left, right and centre, and it's just so interesting to connect that to the Thames water as well. I think that's really fascinating. Absolutely. I mean, gosh, when you go down there at night particularly, there is a real sense that you're not alone. Oh my God. Scary. It's not frightening at all. Is it not? No, not at all. It's quite comforting, actually. I find it quite comforting that, especially during this whole pandemic thing, is just knowing that, you know, people have been here before. People have done all of this, you know. They've been through pandemics. They've been through wars. They've been through all sorts of things, and we're still here today. And just, I find the past incredibly comforting in that respect, to be able to look back and see what human beings have endured, really, and come through from. You know, I find the past incredibly comforting. So yeah, you're definitely not alone down there. There's definitely a sense of, London's like that, isn't it? You know, it's just been, so many people have passed through it and lived in it, and 2,000 years really. And then, of course, you find prehistoric objects as well. So you find these things that were made thousands and thousands of years ago out of flints, before London even existed. So you're finding those kind of objects as well. It really is quite a remarkable place. What about the more earlier 21st century stuff like plastic? Do you come across that a lot? Yeah. I mean, people say, what will we be remembered for? And it's really obvious. It's plastic. We're the plastic age. When you're down on the foreshore, you realise that there's microplastic down there in the sand. There's rubbish catchers. You don't see much of it in central London, but if you look at any of those rubbish catchers, they're always full. It's just floating just below the surface, a few inches below the surface. So you don't really see it. Up towards Hammersmith, the wet wipes that are going in the sewage and are creating islands. So we're actually changing the geography of the river with our rubbish, and where our ancestors' rubbish was essentially organic. It's going to go back to where it came from, glass and metal and wood and leather. Ours is here forever, and it's horrible stuff. It really is horrible. So we're not leaving anything really nice behind, I don't think. Have you noticed an increase in the last 20 years that you've been on the foreshore of plastic? No, not an increase. I mean, it's always been pretty steady. The wet wipes have got worse because people used them. People didn't really use them so much 20 years ago. Wet wipe situations got a lot worse. Through the pandemic, I've noticed more face masks and gloves. Yeah.
basically, if it fits down a toilet, it'll end up in the river. So it's horrible. And the reason that the raw sewage goes out into the river is because we've still got Bazalgette's old sewers. They can't cope with the number of people who live in London. If they didn't let it go when it rained, because the rainwater goes in with the sewer water, it would just bubble up into the streets and people's houses. They have to let it go. They're building the Tideway Tunnel at the moment, which should sort that problem out. In the meantime, my goodness, it's disgusting sometimes down there.
Yeah. What about on the opposite of that? Do you see much wildlife around there?
You do.
Tell me about it. What do you see?
That's the other thing. The river brings wildlife into central London. You see quite incredible things, like little flatfish in the shallows in central London.
That's cool.
I've seen, it must have been a porpoise. I only saw its back come up a couple of times under the Millennium Bridge.
Wow.
Seals up at Gabriel's Wharf I've seen. They've come right up to Richmond. There've been obviously whales in the river, not very well when they've come up too far. Eels, elvers and eels, lots of different sorts of fish. I found a seahorse on the foreshore in front of the Globe. It was dead.
Yeah.
But there is a colony of them, isn't there, up at on the Greenwich Peninsula way. So I found a seahorse right up there.
Cool.
All sorts of things. And then, of course, there's the alien invaders, the ones that have come in the ships and invaded us, like the zebra mussels and those horrible crabs, the furry-footed crabs.
Yeah. Have you seen any of those?
Oh, yeah, you see them, particularly out further out towards the estuary.
Wow.
You see them. Yeah, they're doing terrible damage, and of course, they burrow into the banks.
Yeah.
That's the damage they make. And there are even scorpions, aren't there, out at the Chatham Docks?
Scorpions?
They came in the 19th century in some Italian marble, and now there's an amazing colony of scorpions out in the old docks. Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah, there's some really amazing creatures and stories, because they all came like years and years ago. They're not new. Most of them aren't new. There are some new ones, but yeah, killer shrimps, all sorts of strange things.
Amazing.
Yeah.
God.
And the birds, the birds fly free in the river. They're not swooping around, cars and buildings. They can actually fly down the river, and they look beautiful. There's some falcons that live on top of the Tate Modern. They roost up there, and I saw one swoop down. Very early one morning, swooped down and caught a pigeon midair.
Oh my
God!
God!
And flew off with it.
Oh my God, that's so cool!
Yeah, it's amazing.
Wild. Wow, so cool. Very cool. I was going to ask you, sorry, my accent gets mixed up. Have you heard of Ontology?
Ontology?
Yeah.
No, I haven't. No, what's that?
So the story goes, I was reading a book, and there was Noel Hume.
Ivan Noel Hume.
Yes, and you describe him as the godfather of modern mudlarks, which I think is great. And he published a book in 1974 called All the Best Rubbish.
Yes.
And when I read that, it lit up a memory of mine with a photography project I did. And it was based on ontology. And ontology defines as the philosophical study of the nature of being, existence, or reality, as well as the basic categories of being and their relations. So I then sort of got interested of asking people what their most significant object was. And so what I did is I went to people's homes, and I was 18 at the time. So all my friends that I did it with, I had to go to their parents' house, and I asked them to go into their bedroom because it's like more personal to them. And then what I did was ask them to take a seat and ask them what their most significant object was. And then I set up the camera and I set it on a 30-second exposure, and I record their dialogue as they talk to me. And whilst they talk, they either be really like animated holding the object as they talk, or they can be really like still. You get completely different results. And the photograph is like a ghost of these people, but the body language of like how they're expressing themselves for these objects was what I really wanted to capture. And it was all because of this ontology term. And I was interested to ask you what your most significant object was.
Significant object.
Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you found either. It could be anything that, is significant to you if you had one.
It's like, what is the object that you would save in a house fire?
Yes, exactly.
Is it the thing that you would rush, grab and run out of the house with? Okay, well, the thing that I would grab and run out, apart from my family and the cats, would be when my children were little. They were born 5 weeks early, so were tiny, and we had bronze casts made of their hands and feet, and they are just absolutely tiny. And just the perfect memory of them, because now they've got great big feet and hands. And I would grab those. I think those are the things that mean the most to me.
I love that. That's
I would
great.
take those. Yeah.
How many pairs are there?
Well, I've got twins. So
have you got twins?
So we've got two different feet and two different hands.
Nice. Oh, that's good. I love that.
Yeah.
Good answer. I like that. Okay, cool. Well, I've also got some questions from the public for you.
Oh,
Excited?
Really?
Yeah. So, first off, can I join a group that will help me get started? So in
you
mudlarking.
Certainly can, yes. Everyone asked me this, and it's a really good way to start mudlarking, because some people are a bit nervous about going down there. I should say it's quite safe. So long as if you're in central London, it'll be quite safe. You just need to keep an eye on the tides. That's the thing that'll cut you off. But it's a good way to start, is to go with a group. And Thames Explorer Trust and Thames Discovery are the two organisations who have permission from the Port of London Authority to do them. And very, very few. They're about the only organisations with permission. So they are the people to do it with. They do group tours, and they also do bespoke tours, so you can go on your own. If you go with them, you don't necessarily have to have your own permit either, which is good. You won't be allowed to take anything away because you don't have a permit, but you can sort of hop on theirs to do your tour. And then if you want to get your own permit and go back, then you're all set to go. So so they're the best people, and they're non-profit as well. So all the money goes back into the great work that they do on the river.
Perfect. All right, that's good to know. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Next, we've got, can you describe the satisfaction you have when you find something?
I can. It's like, I think in the book I describe it as, all my birthdays come at once, or that feeling you get just before Christmas. It's that excitement, that real hit. You get a massive hit, a jolt almost, the moment you spot it. And it's that moment when you're looking at it, it's there and nobody's touched it, is the moment I absolutely savour and make last as long as possible, because as soon as you touch it, it does somehow break the spell, because before you've touched it, nobody's touched it before. And then you touch it, and you're the first person to touch it, maybe even in 2,000 years. And once you take it off the foreshore and out of its environment, then it loses something else. And each step of the way, it loses something. But that moment you spot it, that instant you see it, is the magical moment. And that, I suppose it's almost like a drug, because that's what keeps me coming back and doing it again and again for that feeling. That's
so cool. That's awesome. That's a very good description. Well done. I like that one. And last but not least is a bit of a trick question. What are your secret spots? But if you tell us, they won't be a secret.
Do you know what? It's people always ask me that, and a lot of mudlarks don't like to talk about their secret spots. And I've got a second book out now. It's a field guide to larking, and in it I have listed some places to go mudlarking.
Okay.
And it's really not rocket science. Think about the best places to go will be the places where people have dropped the most. So it's going to be the places that were busy. So it's going to be central London, obviously, that's been populated for 2,000 years. So if I say go to the foreshore at Bankside, or I go to the foreshore at Wapping, it's obvious that you're going to find something there What I don't tell people is where to go on those foreshores. They're quite long. Or how to find things, because the river does wash things together. It does behave in a certain way. And you do learn to read the foreshore. Most mudlarks go back to the same spot again and again and again. And they watch it and they learn it and they see how it changes. They know the places where things are likely to wash up. They know the signs that'll tell them if that spot's worth searching. And that's just something that you learn by doing it lots. You just learn to do that. But, really and truly, best spots, look on the old maps, work out where people were, where the river stairs were, where, things were busy and things were being dropped and things were being dumped. And that's where you'll find the most stuff. The rest of it, you have to learn yourself, really.
That's good. That makes a lot of sense. How old are we when we talk about these maps? How old are these maps we're talking about? I
mean, they go back to the Agas map, really, is the most useful wise, and that's 16th century. So you can find maps going right the way through from the 16th century through to now that will give you lots of information about where things were and what was happening, and good places to go. So, but it's not hard to work out best places to go. It's the actual, once you're down there, it feels like a big place when you're searching it. And all I'd say to people is slow down. Don't march off quickly. Don't look too hard. If you look too hard, you won't find things. And just look slowly and carefully and take your time. And eventually you'll start seeing things and finding things.
It reminds me of, I used to go scuba diving, and it would be a case that you'd have to stay in the same spot and wait for things to start being noticeable in front of you. But a lot of divers will carry on going. But it's when you stop, that's when you start to realise all these things start happening in front of you. It just reminded me of that. And it's to do with water as well, which is great.
That's true, yeah. I mean, I would say it's a bit like a magic eye, sort of you just stop and look at it and look for straight lines and perfect circles, because nature doesn't tend to make perfectly straight lines and perfect circles, and they do start to jump out at you in the end. You get your eye in. It's called getting your eye in. That's what my bugs call it. And, once you found it took me years to find my first coin. But once I found one, it's something imprinted, I think, and I found them from then onwards. So, it's just patience and time, really.
Well, there you go. Thank you. And finally, one last question from me is, have you got any take-home messages for our listeners?
Take-home messages?
Yeah.
Gosh, how do you mean?
Anything that you'd like the listeners to remember for the future, a message from you?
Remember for the future? Just think about what you're flushing down the toilet, I think.
There you go. Perfect. That's a very good advice.
Because that really does affect the future. Where do you think all the stuff in the rivers ends up in the oceans, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Sort of think before you flush. There you go. It's not very, it's really not very glamorous, but, we've got to start looking after the planet. And when you spend time outside and you spend time in a place like the river and you see what we're doing to it, it's heartbreaking. It really is. And, we can all do a little bit. And we all need to, we all should.
That's great. That's perfect. Thank you. What a great note to finish on. I appreciate that. Well, Lara, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate all your wisdom and stories and everything.
You're welcome.
I hope you get better from COVID.
Do you know, I feel absolutely fine. I've just got this annoying cough, but apart from that, I feel absolutely fine.
You've now reached the end of today's episode. What a lovely person that Lara is. To follow her progress, you can find her on her Instagram under london.mudlark, and her Twitter is londonmudlark, one word. I hope you enjoy the last few weeks of your summer before we hit autumn. If you're looking for something fun to do in London, why not check out the Totally Thames Festival, which is on from the 1st of September until the 30th. And it's filled with lots of goodies, including a guided tour around the Greenwich Peninsula, hosted by yours truly, the Thames Estuary Partnership. Once again, a huge thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to have you here. This episode has been brought to you by me, Chloe Russell, on behalf of the Thames Estuary Partnership, and I look forward to welcoming you next time. Bye-bye.